The 1968 coup. Dr. Arnulfo Arias went to the movies with several members of his family in downtown Panama City on the evening of October 11, 1968. Arias, the perennial caudillo of the Panamanista Party, had won sweet revenge for his loss amid charges of fraud in the 1964 presidential elections, won by Marco Robles. This time, Arias won the election easily. Despite the angry, violent election campaign, he was now a happy man, enjoying the aftermath of the elections. In another part of the city, Colonel Omar Torrijos was packing his bags for a flight to San Salvador, where he was being sent into virtual exile as military attaché because of Arias's victory. The day would end quite differently for these men. Despite the decisive outcome of the elections, it had been a contentious, angry election campaign, very bloody, very dirty, in which values seemed twisted. The election season had begun with intensified guerrilla actions by supporters of Arias in the mountains, who had taken their complaint of political corruption to the hills. Torrijos was responsible for defending against the guerrilla attacks, which were centered in my home province of Chiriquí, on the border with Costa Rica. The Arnulfista clashes with the military grew in intensity. At the start of the campaign for president, Arias formed a coalition with José Bazán and Arturo del Valle. The coalition was united in opposition to the civilian government of President Robles, whom the National Guard, along with its leader, General Vallarino, supported. The coalition organized demonstrations and protests and pushed for Robles' impeachment on corruption charges. In one notable protest, Torrijos was assigned the job of crowd control. When the demonstration got out of hand, Torrijos ordered troops to fire tear gas at the crowd. A number of prominent members of the Arias coalition were overcome by the fumes. That put an end to the civil disobedience, but it solidified the animosity between Torrijos, still a lieutenant colonel in the National Guard, and Arnulfo Arias. When Arias won the presidency, he showed his disdain by announcing that he would make his barber the head of the secret police. Among the existing officers, Torrijos was one of the first to be blacklisted. At the time, I was still in Chiriquí, far from the leadership struggle in the capital. Torrijos was only one of many in trouble with the new government. The Panamanistas came to power, bent on revenge. Arias's cabinet proceeded to dismantle the National Guard structure and banish National Guard officers they didn't like. Essentially, the new regime split the military between friends and enemies of the Arnulfistas. Torrijos had been effectively removed from the center of activity. He was on the sidelines and knew nothing about the ongoing conspiracy about to unfold. As he prepared to leave the country, a group of conspiring officers, Boris Martinez, Federico Boyd, Ramiro Silveira, Amado Sanjur, and Humberto Jimenez among them, plotted against Arias. They knew that it was just a matter of time before they too would be blacklisted, banned, or sent into exile. Finally, on October 11, 1968, while Torrijos packed his bags and Arias enjoyed a night on the town, the men held a decisive meeting in Panama City. After the meeting broke up, Martinez flew to Chiriquí and the coup sprang into motion. He seized control of key government outposts and radio stations in the province, detaining several prominent Arias party leaders. He and his friends then turned to extending their control to Panama City. But when they went in search of the president, they couldn't find him. Only his closest aides knew where he was, and word came to Arias of the troop movements while he was still at the theater. Arias never returned home. He went directly to the Panama Canal Zone, seeking refuge with the Americans. Many other Arnulfistas followed him into exile, first to the Canal Zone, then on to Miami. Torrijos never left for El Salvador. He unpacked his bags and prepared for big changes. Boris Martinez, as the key proponent of the coup, was the de facto head of the new military government. But Torrijos came into increasing prominence, along with Silveira, Luis Nensen Franco, and Sanjur. There was a swift reorganization of the Guard, including formation of a staff structure. Torrijos was named commander of the armed forces, but Boris Martinez was a member of the high command and a man to be reckoned with. The two men never got along well, and the dual leadership role strained their relationship much more. Martinez was more hard-line than Torrijos was, and quicker and more forceful in making decisions. He was opposed to the civilian power structure, and so more radical in that sense, and very much anti-communist. All of this clashed with Torrijos, who was even-tempered most of the time and cultivated the art of diplomacy on all levels. Each protagonist had his supporters. In the period between October 11, 1968, and February 3, 1969, there was constant squabbling. Whether in working meetings, the dining room, or the barracks, the two leaders were always disagreeing. Torrijos was troubled by the weight of decisions upon him during this period. He confided his concern and anguish about Martinez to several members of his family. Torrijos started getting wind of a plan by Martinez and Boyd to oust him. He decided to react first. On February 3rd, Torrijos arrested Martinez and sent him on a military plane to exile in Miami, along with Boyd and other conspirators. Thus, Torrijos seized the reins and obtained full control of the military government. The problems abated, but the conflict was far from over. Lieutenant Colonels Amado Sanjur, Ramiro Silvera, and Luis Nensen Franco, some of the same men who had supported Torrijos against Boris Martinez, now were preparing another coup attempt. This operation was advanced, supported, aided, and abetted by the CIA and U.S. military intelligence. The United States supported these men in trying to oust Torrijos on grounds he was a communist sympathizer or at least a leftist. The coup plotters bided their time. The strategy was to isolate Torrijos while he was traveling outside Panama. Finally, on December 15, 1969, Torrijos went on a trip to Mexico. He was troubled by events in Panama, but was not aware of the plot against him. The conspirators marched into headquarters and declared that the deed had been done. They were deposing Torrijos because he was a communist. The coup was not successful. Lower-ranking officers, me among them, continued to back Torrijos. I helped Torrijos sneak back into the country on a private plane through Chiriquí. I rallied support for Torrijos from our base in Chiriquí and helped arrange for a secret nighttime landing on a flight from San Salvador, the capital of El Salvador. The plane flew out over the Pacific Ocean undetected. I had ordered jeeps and trucks to be brought down to the landing strip after dark, awaiting the arrival. When we made radio contact, I ordered the vehicles to turn on their lights. The plane landed and I saluted Torrijos as he alighted. There was a cheer from our men. "Viva Torrijos!" We rallied our loyal units from there. By morning, the coup dissolved. Not a shot was fired. The coup plotters were jailed for 2 months until the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency launched a clandestine operation that set them free. Torrijos assumed direct individual control of the National Guard for the first time. Omar Torrijos' ascension to supreme command of the Panamanian Armed Forces was for me the fulfillment of the conversation I had had with him that carnival night 7 years earlier. New thinking, a new concept of what it meant to be a Panamanian. Many people vastly underestimate or choose to ignore the revolution that came with Omar's ascension to power. It was a social revolution that improved the lot of the lower classes for the first time. The wealthy classes had never paid much attention to the majority of the poor people in the country. But under Torrijos, there was investment in public health care and education, roads were built, public sector jobs were created. In focusing on popular empowerment and bringing about a significant change in the social conditions and mobility of a generation of Panamanians, Torrijos won the lasting enmity of the powers that cared little for the majority of impoverished, dark-skinned Panamanians, the class from which I came. Because of this social agenda, the United States, which was naturally aligned with the tall, white-skinned oligarchy, came to regard Torrijos as a communist. Torrijos ridiculed the label. We were not tied to the Cubans, nor to the Soviet Union, although we sometimes had contacts with them, often at the behest of the United States. What is true about Torrijos is that he had a social conscience, a sense of concern for the peasant class, for the workers, and for that reason, some called him a socialist, and others called him a communist. The American analysts would be referring to Torrijos all the time as a Marxist. This, in the thick of the Cold War, was the same thing as calling someone the devil himself. I remember once telling Torrijos about what the Americans were saying, and he began to laugh. "The only possible way you could call me a communist would be in matters of love," he said. Torrijos' rise was also a political revolution that gave power to the new face of Panamanian nationalism. This too challenged the role of the United States and earned its suspicion. Omar and the military had already garnered the hatred of the traditional political classes, and that would not change. The American government recognized that it would be very important to keep tabs on Torrijos as he developed his social agenda and his plan to revise the canal treaties. We had an interesting situation when Torrijos came back to Panama in triumph. Some people had jumped the gun on congratulating Omar's opponents. For a day or so, there was a flood of telegrams congratulating Nensen, Silvera, Sanjur, and the others for their great victory. The messages were published on entire pages of newspapers. I remember one in particular from a Panamanian consul somewhere in the Far East named Juan Gomez, who sent a telegram congratulating the new military leaders. 48 hours later, of course, Torrijos was already back in Panama City, and we got another telegram from Gomez. This one read, "Cancel previous telegram." As we laid out the plot against him, it became clear that Torrijos had enemies all over. He was shocked. "But it's like everyone was against me," he said in disbelief. "It seems as if I never had any real friends at all, that I was fooling myself." We summed it up with the example of a supported dear friend, Enrique Chino Jaramillo, who owed his job as manager of the Banco Nacional to Torrijos. Jaramillo was a drinking buddy. He played piano at Torrijos' parties. When we had to sneak Torrijos back into the country, the first person we thought of was Jaramillo, asking him for money to pay for the plane to get the general back to Panama. Not only did Jaramillo refuse, but he also spoke out against Torrijos in favor of the conspirators. It came to the point where Torrijos would walk around headquarters, saying only half-jokingly, as if he were talking to himself, "Damn, Torrijos, whatever you do, don't let yourself get thrown out again, because the next time you won't have anybody left on your side." I've often thought of this episode in later years. It's the nature of Panama, maybe the nature of mankind. Morality has the capacity to bend when power is concerned. It's axiomatic. There are no friends, only friends of the throne. The poor, humble man has a tighter group of real friends than the elevated, landed power broker. In the business of government and politics, you can trust no one. As Torrijos analyzed the forces and circumstances that led to the December 15th uprising against him, his natural tendency to seek revenge softened with the overwhelming feeling that it was he in Panama that had to change. He reacted with a sense of forgiveness that was fascinating for me to observe. At the pinnacle of his career, here was a man who had the capacity to pardon his enemies. Perhaps he was even more disposed to pardon his enemies than he was to forgive those closest to him. He was very demanding of us. This was the source of what is still known as Torrijismo. What grew from the consolidation of Torrijos' power was a popular movement founded upon the idea that Panama had to change its ways. Torrijismo became a national social program, a prescription for greater dignity and greater allegiance to labor, to the poor, to students, to people of color, all of whom never before had been a focus of concern from the wealthy power brokers. Hand in hand with this social revolution came the idea that Panama needed to express its own independence. And there was one focal point for our independence, a monument to Panama's existence and reason for being, there for all the world to see. It was the narrow seaward passage that cuts 2 continents from Atlantic to Pacific. The passage that has been the focus of American greed over our territory and our politics and our lives.